professor, physician, epidemiologist. I am Dr. Sri Banerjee. I'm Dr. Sri Banerjee, core faculty for the College of Health Sciences at Walden University. In this video, I will be going over the public health systems-based approach. And in this particular video, I will be further exploring all that there is about the tongue. Now, I used the tongue in the title for effect a little bit more so than the actual um, topic that I'll be discussing. So more importantly, what I'll be discussing here is related to facets that are typically connected to the tongue. Now, the tongue is a very muscular organ, and so in, of course, medical school, we spent quite a bit of time trying to study this. But in the context of public health, the point I'm trying to make here, you can use a different approach to study various organs. So what are some of the characteristics that are connected to the tongue? Can you think about that a little bit? Some of the characteristics that come to mind, of course, is taste, right? But what else? So be thinking about that question as I keep describing some of the other facets in this lecture. Okay, so the general approach that I'll take in presenting this topic, I want you to make note of that. And there's a very important reason that I want you to make note. When you are taking kind of an organ systems-based approach, so I have been trained in the area of medicine. I'm a trained physician, so automatically, one of the things that I look at is a systems-based approach when understanding public health in a methodical manner. So let me show you this approach. So first step is, focus on some sort of organ or organ system. So here we decided to actually focus on the tongue. You could have decided to include the whole oral pharynx. So the oral pharynx is comprised of hard palate, soft palate, the front 2/3 of the tongue. So in the context of which discipline you are trying to understand the topic, this will make a difference in what approach you use. Again, if you're thinking about the public health aspects, you almost always want to think about related aspects as well, right? So maybe comparative embryology might be one way to go. And I'll show you where that might play a role. Understanding the physiology, of course, very important. Oral microbiota. Now, gut microbiota, oral microbiota, these are things that are really gaining a lot of traction in science, and understanding that there is a complex milieu of microorganisms that reside in any of these cavities, and that in order for proper functioning and also proper health, it's very important that a lot of these organisms are in symbiotic balance with each other, and not one organism is overgrowing or undergrowing. So this is something of a realization that I came to very early on, actually 20 years ago, when I was in the Centers for Disease Control. I was working with nosocomial infections and the development of hospital-acquired infections, and how the oral microflora and the development of biofilms on teeth led to plaque, and led to result in cardiovascular disease. So again, that's another tangent that you could take that with in order to understand public health. And I'm trying to show you all the different ways that you could take one topic and then branch out into various disciplines and various fields according to which discipline you belong to. If you're looking at some of the health services or the business aspect of it, some of the expenditures in the health sector, as it pertains to the disease, might be something additional you may want to look into. Okay, so sensory versus motor. Now, this is a very important distinction in terms of um, when you're thinking about stroke. So when you think about stroke, some of the more fine sensory qualities might be diminished, but more importantly, when there are um, deficits in gross motor function or even fine motor function, some of them are actually very much visible within the movement of the tongue. So certain cranial nerves are specifically geared towards innervating the tongue so that it can move in certain ways. So, what's my point here? The point is that when you're trying to study things like stroke, which is a major public health concern, it's sometimes important to understand what is the case definition and what is the way that was used to diagnose. Then you want to make the distinction between chronic versus infectious, and how are we, treating the two differently versus similar. So again, talking about the oral microflora and how that relates to chronic disease, of course, is very important. And a lot of my um, former students, some of my former students, in fact, have written on the importance of that connection between infectious disease. My most recent graduate, Dr. Mary Beth Greenway, actually wrote her whole dissertation on the connection between Clostridium difficile infection and some of the more common chronic diseases that you can think of, such as diabetes and obesity. And so in some places there was actually connections made. So similarly within the oral microflora, I would suspect that if there were certain associations to be studied, we could easily find that. And then, of course, there is the social determinants of health that are extremely important, and this is where the discussion of food insecurity are extremely important. And that is a good segue to the next slide where we talk about my um, research and some of the collaborative research that I have been engaged in with other um, faculty member from within the university and across other universities and other disciplines as well. So this is a paper that was published actually very recently, this year, and this shows the association between food insecurity and mortality in a nationally representative um, population. And this was conducted using the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey. And so the findings, this was a really significant paper that was actually published in the Health Promotion Practice Journal, and really some important and key findings. So the reason I then go back to embryology when we are discussing this is because I want to point out that there's a couple of things that are going on in embryology. So this is a comparison, let me make note here, of protostomes versus deuterostomes. So deuterostomes, these are actually two types of organisms who split off 600 million years ago. So um, if you think about, so 600 million years ago, there was a common ancestor, okay? So that common ancestor split off into protostomes versus deuterostomes. So why am I spending a little bit of time talking about this? Well, it's really important that um, when fertilization occurs, some of the first stages in the um, egg differentiation, especially when there's the eight cell stage, for protostomes, the first area to be formed is the blastospore and the mouth. So this is considered the Annelida family, the earthworms and other organisms, mollusca, echinoderms, all of these are considered. So think about earthworms when you're thinking about protostomes. And then when you think of deuterostomes, um, of course, in week 4, about week 4, first the anus is formed right here. and then about week 8 or 9, the mouth is formed. So what I'm trying to show you here is that the the gastric development, the development of the whole cavity actually is so important that mutations very rarely occur during this time, and there's not too much. There's this is the basis. This is the basis behind almost every fetus develops. So if you're thinking about how that goes on, there's not too much difference between amphibians and earthworms and how human development takes place. Another difference that I want you to keep in mind is the spiral cleavage versus the radial cleavage. So spiral cleavage takes place when additional cells form. They form at a 90-degree angle. So if you make 90 degrees, you'll see that every subsequent cell is differentiating in that way. However, in radial cleavage, this actually takes place off of the 90-degree angle, so this doesn't quite develop in the same way. And also there is indeterminate differentiation of these cells. So the idea is that each one of these cells could individually be differentiated into a whole human being. So some really fascinating side facts. All of these are not necessarily important to know, but what is important to know is there are rare circumstances where some of this development does get hindered, and when that does happen, then you want to be thinking about some sorts of diseases and potential public health implications of that. So, what is there's a trend that's happening now as we're entering the age of understanding precision medicine, personalized medicine. The way we arrange ends, right? The way we arrange samples from the population is different. So the characteristics that we would oftentimes think of as individual characteristics, because of more measurements and more technology, Internet of Things, we're able to create subgroups of people and commonalities in places where we were not able to do so. So what's one example of that? The genetic code, of course, the Human Genome Project being all cracked by now, and all of many of the phenotypes being discovered, we're able to now do sort of DNA genotyping and understanding how this is different for different groups, and public health then evolves in understanding some of these differences in a more effective way. And so that, of course, thereby increases the efficiency by which we administer public health, but not only that, this increases the effectiveness. And what are we here for as public health practitioners is to be able to improve the effectiveness of community level interventions. So, moving on, trying to think about this a little bit more, just specifically how differentiation takes place within the cell. This is, of course, the one cell zygote when the sperm and the egg meet. That's the very first stage, but then differentiation takes place very rapidly. And the zona pellucida, of course, is the clear area outside, and then the differentiation into the morula stage. And of course, you know, the type of cleavage that is taking place is creating a more rapid sort of differentiation. So in this paper, there are actually some examples of perturbations of this process. And so if there's perturbations here, sometimes there is a need to better understand it through public health studies. So this is a uh, picture on the left is of my Bengal cat, and then on the right, of course, a wild um, cat with the tongue open. And so this kind of um, brings us back to the primal implications of what a tongue represents. And so um, let's see. So what are some of the cultural perspectives on tongue? And of course, we have to take that into consideration if we're thinking about public health as well. And I'm going to show you in a second why. I'm going to give you a story of I actually had gotten sick in India, and one of the things that I was getting every night is this fever, unexplained fever. I had a little bit of a runny nose, and so I went to uh, the doctor, and so it happened to me. It happened to be the same doctor my mother went to as a child. So I went in there expecting the traditional sort of physical exam and everything, and instead the the physician who was also a homeopathist, he asked me to stick out my tongue and then show um, that if there was any fever. And so this is a common practice, actually, even with uh, Western doctors in India and other countries who are trained in the Western tradition also use the tongue as an initial entry point in understanding diagnosis. Because of the reliance of the population of understanding tongue diagnosis, sometimes this is done as a gateway to gain the trust of the patient. So it's really important and to understand some of these, some of the cultural relevance of this. This is a common practice in low and middle income countries, and one of the reasons being is that the feasibility and the practicality of Western medicine is just not there. Why? Because the cost for much of the population, or some of the population at least, is prohibitive for some of that. But homeopathy is a lot more affordable for the population. So if we're thinking about the basic structure of the tongue, I of course have spent um, a lot of training in pathology and histology, looking at the structure, the something called the circumvallate papillae, and all of the different types of papillae. And these actually have specialized types of glands and things. So on a basic level, if you are familiar with histology and the types of epithelial tissue, then this is going to look familiar. There's squamous cell, there's basal cell, there's columnar cells, there's cuboidal cells, transitional epithelial tissue, and for instance, in the bladder. So just, for those of you that might need a little bit of a review, you can go ahead and, access some of the resources. But on a basic level, the two types of cells are basal cells and columnar cells. And glandular cells are typically columnar cells. And you can see that in this histological structure here with these columnar cells right here. They're very tall. So you can't really miss them. And then some of these secretions are stored in there of glands. And of course, there's a lot of salivary glands that are there. And of course, it's really important to note that in about a week and a half, all the cells are renewed in the tongue. So a little bit about, let's, do a little bit of a paradigm shift. And like to think of things in different ways because I think this is the best way that learning happens is when you start to think outside of the box. So be prepared to start thinking outside. So let's not think about the tongue and the mouth and everything as just, um, you know, eating food and tasting. Let's look at this whole picture as kind of a flow. So flow versus deformation. So there's a lot of different facets. That's what I'm trying to say. If you're thinking about liquids and fluids, there's a lot of different facets, shear force, and uh, that are pertaining to rheology. So if we think about it in kind of a holistic way, this is what I'm asking you to do, then we can start to think more creatively. So we'll go back to that concept a little bit more, and including more facets of the tongue. But let's also be thinking about some of the pathologies on the tongue, because now that you have seen the histology, well, as it turns out, tongue cancer is in fact on the rise on in 2019, and this might be because of better diagnosis, but the rate has increased. However, the good news is that there is a slight decline in the death rate. So these are the trends, and on your own time, you can visit and take a look at some of the more important characteristics. And of course, the SEER data set is extremely important in identifying cancers and everything related. So, if when you're thinking about tongue cancer, what are some things that you think about? Well, human papillomavirus, HPV. And of course, Gardasil is an extremely effective vaccine that is um, preventing against certain subtypes, some of the more malignant subtypes of HPV. And so 70% of all oral cancers are actually coming from HPV. So this really demonstrates the need for preventable vaccines. And this is another connection to public health, where we're needing to understand vaccination rates and how to increase vaccination rates. This is something that we're discussing currently, really about with all the different pandemics. And so COVID is something that is near and dear in trying to address and mitigate circumstances. So um, this is a good website to visit, and I encourage you to visit this website on your own time. And so this goes into a lot of stat facts of different cancers, including some of the more common cancers like colon cancer, lung cancer, everything. So I really encourage you to look at all of the different facets that are involved. So, this is another paper that was there. And remember, we left off thinking about the paradigm shift, about thinking about flavor and the tongue as more than just a receptor for flavor, but also all of the sensations that go along with the eating experience. So think about your tongue as having moist hotspots for orosensory stimulation. So this is associated, importantly, this is associated with increased insulin release. So this is an important premise here, because what the authors are trying to say, that eating slow would give more time for insulin to increase prior to ending the meal. And so what does that mean? That many studies are actually showing that when you eat slow, because of maybe the hard textured foods, maybe lower food intake, whatever the reason is, people that actually have type 2 diabetes and are overweight, because of increased orosensory duration, this is better with maintaining blood glucose homeostasis. So that's food for thought, very important. So that gets into the second concept that talks about mouthfeel or oral haptics, which shapes that whole eating experience. So it's not just the sight of the food, it's also the feel in your hands. It's all the types. It's the vision. It's even hearing. All of these things. All of the senses. Now in Western culture, of course, we're so used to cutlery, using knives, forks, and spoons, that we don't use our hands, and so the tactile portion of that is lost in some ways. But I would argue that some of the sensation of cutlery even is stimulating and provides the orosensory experience. So, what are alternative ways to understand food? And so, food desire. So, now what I'm going to try to do is bring back the concept of food insecurity that I introduced to you at the beginning of this talk, and then fuse that along with food desire, so that we can have a more complete picture of understanding food insecurity. So, if we're taking a look at this, taste phenotype is something that is key. So taste phenotype, what does that mean? The genetic components of taste. So some are super tasters. Some do not taste as much. So how does that make a difference? There are other types of genetic variations that you want to be thinking about. The mouth feel, that's something, of course, is the physical sensations in the mouth that is produced by a particular food. And we're going to go into a couple of examples of that. But the fact is that the orosensory dopaminergic circuits increase eating desire. So the reward pathway, the reward circuit that is located within your brain, which includes, of course, the substantia nigra and different components, is extremely important. And then when eating desire is intense, of course, we call that craving. So here's a study which showed some really important points, and I'm going to be very brief in describing this. But when there is a concordance and an agreement between liking the food and consuming the food, so when there's concordance, then you know there's not as much restraint being exercised. Um, so if you think about compared to the individuals, you know, comparing individual bitter taste measures, so basically the hidden taste variables showed stronger associations than the actual diet quality index. So um, adiposity, cardiovascular risk factors like you know, the amount of HDL cholesterol, the amount of LDL cholesterol, all these things actually somehow we were able to distinguish with flavor, or the subjects were in the study. So even though liking and intake-based diet quality indexes are you know, pretty correlated, um, the liking-based index actually is a better indicator. And unfortunately, a lot of the food insecurity measures that we are so used to actually don't assess desire or liking as much as it does the actual healthy quality of the food. And I think there's room for improvement and opportunity here. So maybe more qualitative studies that look at dietary quality, um, and and um, and look at desire, or a liking based index might do better in informing food insecurity. So if you're thinking now, and you can visit the study, I've cited this. If you're thinking about taste, you know, chemosensory, genotype, phenotype, think about some of the measurement scales. So let's look at this. Um, So of course, you know, there's super tasters and non-tasters. You saw that, but not only that, it's really important to understand how we're going to measure food insecurity, how we're going to measure desire or likability, all these things, and healthy eating. So many moving parts working together here that it's important to note some of them. One of them, healthy eating index. This is a measure of diet quality used to assess how well a set of foods align with key recommendations of the dietary guidelines for Americans. So, you know, here's another scale. This is a 9-point hedonic scale. So this is actually the most widely used scale for measuring food acceptability. It's been embraced by, you know, many bodies, professional organizations, agencies. David Perriam and colleagues developed the scale at the Quartermaster Food and Container Institute of the U.S. Armed Forces for the purposes of measuring the food preferences of soldiers. So this is something that's previously validated and measured in different populations. And the 9-point hedonic scale is a balanced bipolar scale around neutral at the center with 4 positive and 4 negative categories on each side. And actually, this has been converted in some ways into a labeled magnitude logarithmic scale. So the idea is that the separation is not equal, and so a couple of things. So this is talking more about the pathways that are the sensory pathways. So in the nervous system, there are some somatosensory pathways that trigger certain memories and mechanisms within the brain. So common things like carbonation, you're drinking your soft drink. The tingling sensation that comes from that carbonation is tied to certain responses and potentially reward pathways. So if you decouple some of these reward pathways and capsaicin, of course, the spicy burning, the menthol, the cooling, the Sichuan peppercorns, which consider you to have the tingling and the numbing. So all these sensations are all contributing in ways to satiety, hunger, desire, all of these things. And for the paper, this was published in 2019, looking at some of the subqualities of mouthfeel. And so the idea here, the researchers found is that these subqualities were extremely important indicators for assessing for food and hunger, things like that. Um, what's the mouthfeel for chocolate milk? That this was something interesting because, of course, chocolate milk is something that everyone, many people like to drink. So I'm going to go over some of these here. The thickness, viscosity, that's really important here. And of course, the attribute is bulk. So um, how do we define thickness and viscosity? Well, it's the resistance to flow in the mouth, right? So remember early on rheology, I was talking about flow. So this is rheology, and I'm talking about resistance to that flow and defining it in terms of that. So creaminess is another sort of characteristic attribute, and the perception of oiliness in the mouth and the degree of mouth coating. So this creaminess is perceived when a certain viscosity threshold is reached. So a lot of this is relating to viscosity and how the nature of the of the liquid is and the viscosity of the thickness. Again, here's the paper that you can look into this research a lot further. So, I've been talking a lot about food insecurity, but the fact of the matter is that this is an important social determinant of health. It affects 11% of the population, and this was before the pandemic. And when you visited food banks, and I called around to many of them, trying to, have compile a list of resources for my community when the pandemic was really taking a toll. And so this is a pervasive problem in society, and one of the 5 social determinants happens to be economic stability. And so part of, economic instability, food insecurity can be considered one of those. So it's a facet that really affects all parts of life. So food insecurity definition, of course, it's really important how the categories are made in food insecurity. So high food insecurity is considered households that had no problems, high food, this is, note, high food security. So high food security means that households had no problems or anxiety. So important point to note, it's not just the problems, but the mental health um, that is related to that problem is important. So when you're thinking about marginal food insecurity, now I want you to take a look at, the anxiety. But here now we're introducing something also very important, variety, quality, variety, quantity. So the quality is important. Um, Now this doesn't take into consideration the human, the anxiety portion, but the other human emotion portions are not as strongly provided in that category. But then when we get to low food security, then we're going into some of the more personal human desirability component of it. And this is where I feel, even though it's mentioned here, it's not emphasized. And this is the purpose of this lecture, trying to emphasize what actually this means when it comes to understanding food insecurity. So the rest, of course, very low food security. This is where we're going into um, really, really, troubling aspects. And, again, as I said, in the study that we conducted and published, there was notable impact on overall health and increase in mortality rates. And these were statistically significant. So this is a map of childhood food insecurity within the United States, and this is before the pandemic. And you can see there's a lot of areas here which are heavily affected. And so, the southern states seem to be more affected. Um, and if you look, some of these states like Louisiana have food insecurity, which are higher. Um, and even you see more of the green. So the darker green is 20 to 24% food insecurity rates. So again, states like New Mexico, it's important to pay attention to. Even some of the southern Alabama states have more concentration of food insecurity than other areas. And then another area to note is Maine. So these are all important areas, but even more important to keep in mind is how the pandemic affects these states and regions. So, transitioning from food insecurity to understanding a little bit about oral microbiota, I'm going to briefly mention this, and the reason is that, again, hunger and digestion, food insecurity, um, all of these things I first started studying in the Centers for Disease Control, but in a different way as biofilms. And of course, when you eat, you have residual particles that accumulate within your mouth, and when those residual particles start to rot, and so sometimes um, there's a imbalance with the bacteria causing plaque, and so gingivitis and all of the even inflammation of the heart. So oral microbiota must be in balance. Um, Also, when you have certain viruses which affect the nasopharynx and oropharynx, COVID-19 one of them, but there are others, then the microbiota is upset, and it takes time for equilibrium to once again uh, be maintained. So, several hundred to thousand diverse species actually reside within the mouth. What I say usually that, the mouth usually has millions and millions of, if not more, of bacteria. And so, antibiotic resistance and plaque formation, I hesitate to use the word neat, but one of the neat things from bacteria's perspective that they're able to do is they're able to create communities. And so when they maintain these communities, some of the bacteria that have created the the original layer at the bottom, um, they're not able to be penetrated with regular antibiotic treatment because of the complex interactions of biofilms and the complex signaling, the molecular signaling that takes place so that they can even do something called quorum sensing. So quorum sensing is the ability to understand how much of the population there is and accordingly adjust reproduction. And then finally, of course, these are related to several cardiovascular diseases. So in summary, when we're thinking about hunger, we're not just thinking about hunger. When we're thinking about food insecurity, we're not just thinking about food insecurity. You have to be thinking about the whole experience of eating. You have to be thinking about craving. You have to be thinking about satiety, and then also texture. You have to be thinking about all of these things. What are the experiences? What are the mouthfeel? That the somatosensory uh, reactions that you're having and facing. And then, of course, other principles that you want to be thinking about. So in summary, you want to be, when you're taking a topic, when you're taking a health topic, you have several approaches, but you can take a systems-based approach where you take an organ, take a health problem that is associated with it, and then try to look for multiple connections so that you can research different elements of the same topic. So we started off with the tongue and then evolved that into hunger, food insecurity, and then talking about the whole eating experience. I hope you've enjoyed looking at some of the different facets of hunger and have learned something new. Thank you for listening. And here are my references. Thank you.